Imagine a man whose name you will never know, kneeling in the mud of a Roman field, his hands bound with iron that has worn grooves into his wrists. The soil beneath him is dark, not from rain, but from the blood of those who tried to resist before him. His back carries the scars of 100 lashes, each one a reminder that he is property, not a person. Behind him, a young boy watches, perhaps his son, perhaps just another child born into chains, learning that this is all life will ever be. The man does not cry out. He has no tears left. He simply stares at the horizon, at the distant mountains where free men walk, and he wonders if his bones will ever rest in soil that does not belong to a master. You see, history remembers the emperors, the generals, the architects of empires. But history forgets the silent screams of those who built those empires with their bare hands and broken spirits. Somewhere in the dust of ancient Rome, there are voices that never made it into the scrolls, stories of men and women who dared to stand when standing meant certain death. This is not just another tale of conquest and glory. This is about the moment when the forgotten rose up, when slaves became warriors, when the empire that claimed to rule the world discovered that even the powerless can shake the foundations of power itself. If you walk away from this story, you walk away from them, and they deserve to be remembered. So stay, listen, because what happened next changed Rome forever, and the empire would never be the same again. The Roman Empire in the 1st century before the Common Era was a machine of conquest and control. Its legions marched across continents. Its senators debated in marble halls, and its citizens enjoyed bread and spectacle while the world bent to their will. But beneath the grandeur, beneath the columns and the forums and the victory arches, there existed another Rome. A Rome of chains and whips, of forced labor and silent suffering. It was a Rome built on the backs of slaves, millions of them, taken from every corner of the known world. They worked the fields that fed the empire. They mined the silver that filled its coffers. They built the roads that connected its cities and the aqueducts that brought water to its people. They were the invisible foundation upon which Roman civilization stood, and they were treated as nothing more than tools that happened to breathe. In the year 73 before the Common Era, the Roman Republic was at the height of its power, but cracks were beginning to show. The old traditions were giving way to ambition and greed. Generals competed for glory, politicians schemed for influence, and the gap between the wealthy elite and everyone else widened with each passing year. In the city of Capua, not far from the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, there stood a gladiatorial school, a place where men were trained to kill each other for the entertainment of crowds. These were not volunteers seeking fame. They were slaves and prisoners of war, forced into a life where every day could be their last, where survival meant becoming a spectacle, a piece of entertainment for those who would never know what it meant to fight with nothing to lose. Among these men was a Thracian, a warrior from the lands north of Greece, a man who had once fought as a soldier before being captured and sold into slavery. His name was Spartacus. He was not the first to dream of freedom, and he would not be the last, but he was the one who would turn that dream into a storm that would sweep across the Italian peninsula and force Rome to confront a truth it had long ignored. Spartacus was not alone in his hatred of chains. Around him were men from a dozen different lands, speaking different languages, but united by a common suffering. There were Gauls from the north, fierce and proud, who remembered their homeland and the freedom they had lost. There were Germans, towering and strong, who had been warriors before they became slaves. There were Greeks, educated and cultured, who now lived as property in the very civilization that claimed to admire their heritage. And there were others, countless others, each with a story of how they had been taken, broken, and forced to forget that they were human. The conditions in the gladiatorial school were brutal even by Roman standards. The men were kept in cells, fed just enough to keep them strong for the arena, and trained to kill with precision and spectacle. They were commodities, investments for the lanista, the owner of the school, a man named Lentulus Batiatus, who saw them as nothing more than a means to profit and prestige. But Batiatus made a mistake, the kind of mistake that powerful men often make when they believe those beneath them are too broken to resist. He underestimated the fire that still burned in the hearts of his captives. He believed that chains and walls and the threat of death were enough to keep them compliant. He was wrong. In the spring of that year, Spartacus and a group of around 70 gladiators made a decision that would alter the course of history. They would not wait for freedom to be granted. They would take it. The escape was not elaborate. It was born of desperation and courage. Using kitchen knives and makeshift weapons, they overpowered their guards and fought their way out of the school. The streets of Capua erupted in chaos as armed gladiators, men trained to kill, fled into the countryside. The local authorities were caught completely off guard. This was not supposed to happen. Slaves were supposed to be obedient, resigned to their fate. But these men were gladiators, and they had spent years learning how to survive against impossible odds. They moved quickly, seizing weapons and supplies as they went, and they headed for the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, a volcanic mountain that loomed over the region like a sleeping giant. On the mountain, Spartacus and his followers established a camp, a temporary refuge where they could plan their next move. Word of the escape spread quickly, and it carried with it a message that resonated across the countryside. Freedom was possible, resistance was possible, and soon, other slaves began to join them. Field workers abandoned their plows. Shepherds left their flocks. Servants fled from the villas of their masters. Within weeks, the small band of 70 had grown into hundreds, then thousands. These were not trained soldiers. They were farmers, laborers, ordinary people who had been pushed beyond endurance and who now saw in Spartacus a leader who could give them something they had thought lost forever: hope. The Roman response was swift, but it was also arrogant. The Senate dispatched a force of around 3,000 men under the command of a praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber. It was a small force, deemed sufficient for dealing with what Rome saw as a minor disturbance, a group of runaway slaves who would be crushed and made an example of. Glaber led his men to Mount Vesuvius and surrounded the mountain, blocking the main path down. He believed he had the rebels trapped. All he had to do was wait. Starvation and desperation would do the rest, and then he would march the survivors back to Capua in chains, where they would be crucified as a warning to others. But Glaber did not understand who he was dealing with. Spartacus was not a man who waited for death. He was a man who created opportunities where none seemed to exist. The slopes of Vesuvius were steep and treacherous, covered in thick vegetation and volcanic rock. Glaber's forces controlled the main route, but there were other ways down, paths that seemed impossible to traverse, especially for a large group. Spartacus saw what Glaber did not. He ordered his men to weave ropes from the wild vines that grew on the mountainside. Under the cover of darkness, they descended the steep cliffs on the unguarded side of the mountain, a daring maneuver that required both courage and desperation. By the time the sun rose, Spartacus and his army were behind Glaber's lines. The Romans, confident and unprepared, were caught completely by surprise. The battle was swift and brutal. The rebels, armed with whatever weapons they had taken or fashioned, fell upon the Roman camp with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. Glaber's forces broke and fled in disarray, leaving behind their weapons, their supplies, and their dignity. Rome had suffered its first defeat at the hands of slaves, and the news sent shockwaves through the Republic. This was not supposed to happen. Slaves did not defeat Roman soldiers. Slaves did not outsmart Roman commanders. But it had happened, and now the rebellion was no longer a local problem. It was a crisis. The Senate sent more forces, this time under the command of another praetor, Publius Varinius, who brought a larger and better equipped army. But Varinius met the same fate as Glaber. The rebel army, now numbering in the tens of thousands, defeated his forces in a series of engagements, capturing even more weapons and supplies. With each victory, the legend of Spartacus grew, and with each victory, more slaves joined his cause. By the end of the year, the rebel army had swelled to an estimated 70,000 men and women, a vast and diverse force that moved through southern Italy like a storm, striking at Roman estates, freeing slaves, and redistributing the wealth of the elite to those who had been forced to create it. But Spartacus faced a challenge that went beyond military strategy. He was leading an army of people who had different goals, different dreams, and different ideas about what freedom meant. Some wanted to march on Rome itself, to burn the city and take revenge for centuries of oppression. Others wanted to head north, to cross the Alps and return to their homelands, to leave Italy and Rome behind forever. Spartacus himself favored the northern route. He knew that confronting Rome directly would be suicide in the long run. The Republic had resources that his army could never match. But holding together a force of this size and diversity was like trying to control a wildfire. There were leaders among the rebels who disagreed with him, who wanted glory and vengeance more than they wanted survival. The rebellion continued into the next year, and Rome finally realized that this was not a problem that could be solved with a single legion or a single commander. The Senate appointed Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome and a man hungry for military glory, to take command of the campaign against the rebels. Crassus was given 8 legions, nearly 50,000 men, and he was determined to restore Rome's honor and his own reputation. He was ruthless, disciplined, and he understood that defeating Spartacus required more than just superior numbers. It required breaking the spirit of the rebellion. Crassus began by restoring discipline in his own ranks. When one of his legions faltered in battle, he revived the ancient punishment of decimation, executing every 10th man by lot, a brutal reminder that cowardice would not be tolerated. Then he set about hunting the rebel army with methodical precision. He fortified positions, cut off supply lines, and forced the rebels into a series of engagements where Roman discipline and equipment gave them the advantage. Spartacus tried to move his army north, towards the Alps and freedom, but he was betrayed by circumstances and by divisions within his own ranks. Some of his commanders broke away, taking their followers with them, weakening the overall force. Crassus exploited these divisions, defeating the splinter groups one by one. The final confrontation came in the region of Lucania, in southern Italy. Spartacus, cornered and running out of options, attempted to break through the Roman lines and reach the coast, where he hoped to find ships that could carry his people away from Italy. But the path was blocked, the ships never came, and Crassus closed in with overwhelming force. The battle that followed was a desperate and bloody affair. The rebels fought with the courage of those who knew there was no escape, no surrender, no mercy waiting for them. Spartacus himself led from the front, a warrior to the end, cutting through Roman soldiers in a final attempt to reach Crassus and turn the tide. Ancient sources say he fought like a lion, that he was wounded again and again but refused to fall until his body could take no more. He died on the battlefield, surrounded by enemies, his dream of freedom dying with him. The rebellion was crushed, but the cost had been enormous. Thousands of Romans had died. The economy of southern Italy had been disrupted. The very idea that slaves could challenge the might of Rome had shaken the Republic to its core. Crassus celebrated his victory by ordering the crucifixion of 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, the road that led from Capua to Rome. Their bodies lined the road for miles, a grim and brutal message to anyone who might consider defying Rome again. It was a display of power, but it was also a display of fear. Rome had won, but the victory had revealed a vulnerability that could not be ignored. The rebellion of Spartacus did not free the slaves of Rome. It did not bring down the Republic or end the institution of slavery, but it did something perhaps more significant. It forced Rome to confront the consequences of its reliance on slave labor and the dangers of treating human beings as property. In the years that followed, there were reforms, subtle changes in how slaves were managed, how they were treated, how the possibility of rebellion was anticipated and suppressed. The Roman military adapted, learning from the failures of commanders like Glaber and Verinius. And across the empire, in whispered conversations and hidden gatherings, the story of Spartacus lived on. It became a symbol, a reminder that even the most powerful empire could be challenged, that even those with nothing could find the strength to resist. The borders of the empire did not change overnight, but the internal dynamics shifted. The rebellion exposed the fragility of Roman control in regions where slave populations were dense and Roman military presence was thin. It influenced how Rome approached conquered territories, how it managed its labor force, and how it balanced expansion with internal security. The rebellion also played a role in the political struggles that would eventually lead to the fall of the Republic itself. Crassus used his victory to bolster his political ambitions, forming an alliance with Pompey and Julius Caesar that would reshape Roman politics. The instability and fear generated by the rebellion contributed to the atmosphere of crisis that allowed strongmen to seize power and transform Rome from a republic into an empire ruled by emperors. The legacy of Spartacus extends far beyond the ancient world. His story has been retold countless times, in books and films and speeches, as a symbol of resistance against oppression. He has been claimed by revolutionaries and freedom fighters across the centuries, a figure who represents the universal human desire for dignity and autonomy. But the real legacy, the one that matters most, is the one that was written in the hearts of those who survived. The slaves who heard the story and knew that resistance was possible. The people who lived in fear of their masters, but who carried within them the knowledge that chains could be broken. Rome tried to erase that knowledge with crucifixions and brutal repression, but knowledge like that cannot be erased. It endures, it waits, and it resurfaces whenever people are pushed too far, whenever the powerful forget that power is not the same as legitimacy, and oppression is not the same as order. The man kneeling in the mud, the one whose name we will never know, he did not live to see the rebellion. He died in chains, like so many others, his life consumed by the empire that used him and discarded him. But somewhere, in the years that followed, another man kneeling in another field heard the story of Spartacus and allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that freedom was not a dream reserved for others. That belief, fragile and dangerous as it was, kept him alive. And when the opportunity came, when the moment arrived, he stood, not because he believed he would win, but because he could no longer bear to remain on his knees. That is the true legacy of the slave uprising that shook Rome. Not the battles, or the strategies, or the temporary victories, but the idea that defiance is possible, that resistance has meaning, and that even in the darkest moments, when all seems lost, the human spirit can still rise. Rome learned from Spartacus, but it never truly understood the lesson. Empires rise and fall, borders shift and change, but the fundamental truth remains the same. You cannot build a civilization on the suffering of others and expect it to stand forever. Sooner or later, the foundation cracks. Sooner or later, the forgotten find their voice. And when they do, the world changes, whether those in power are ready for it or not.